I just want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise that continuing connection to lands, waters and communities. I pay respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures and to elders past and present. Tonight I'm on Ngunnawal country, and if you wanted to share the traditional names of the land that you're joining us from, pop it in the chat. It's just one small way that we can pay respect to the traditional owners who have cared for the country that we live and work on long before colonisation ever happened. I also want to acknowledge the tremendous value that lived experience brings to suicide prevention and emphasise that your voice as a person with lived experience is valid and essential for the work that we do together. We're recording the session tonight, and this recording will be made publicly available, so those who aren't able to join us can watch it later. If you're uncomfortable about being recorded, just stay off camera and on mute, and we'll share your comments via the chat. We won't be delving too much into personal stories tonight, but if anything uncomfortable comes up for you, please remember that your self-care strategies are really important, whether it's talking to a trusted person, calling one of the many helplines that are available, or simply processing your emotion in your own way. If you want to have a chat to me after the session, I'm going to put my email address in the chat, and you can reach me on that and we can talk some more offline. So I want to welcome you all here tonight and emphasize that there's no right way to use your lived experience in peer work roles. There are guidelines that exist for peer work, but each role is unique, and the purpose of this session is to bring forward experiences so that we can discuss some of the opportunities that exist in peer-related roles for using your lived experience. These roles are gaining traction in many places in the community, and they involve working in places like health, justice, and other fields where lived experience can add value. Tonight, I'm joined by Lindy Zillman, who has an extensive experience in the design and conduct of peer-related work, and we bring you our experiences and hope to learn from each other, and both you, John and Graham as well, who are joining us tonight. Before we get started, we'll just run through some really short introductions. If you have any questions during the discussion, feel free to add them to the chat and we'll pick up on them through the discussion. And we're a small group tonight, so happy for you to jump in at any point and share your experiences with the topics that we're going to be talking about. So I'm Hayley Burton. I've had a number of lived experience roles in suicide prevention. And in the peer space, I've mentored others who are starting to use their lived experience story in health spaces, in particular with organisations such as Roses in the Ocean. I'm really passionate about deepening the engagement of lived experience in suicide prevention, and that's why I started Critical, as a way of starting these conversations for better engagement. And it's through Critical that we bring you this discussion tonight. So Lindy, I'll throw over to you to introduce yourself, and then we'll get started on the chat.
Oh, thanks, Hayley. So I've been working with Roses in the Ocean now for approximately, 4 years, I'd say, maybe a little bit longer. So in my role with Roses, I work as a facilitator in what's called the Peer Care Companion Workshop, which is training for peer care companions in a variety of different roles. I also work with another workshop called Voices of Insight, Our Voice in Action, and other roles within Roses in the Ocean, mentoring and various groups through the Wayback Service. I've also worked as a peer worker in the Wayback Service. Other mentoring that I've done in other areas, including education. So yeah, I've got a sort of a bit of a crazy background, but they have really become extremely passionate about supporting people with their experience who wish to work in supporting others through, emotional distress or suicidal distress, and being able to provide support in that area. Thanks, Hayley.
Great. Thanks, Lindy. And welcome, Grenville, to the chat tonight as well. Oh, and we've got another person joining us.
Two.
welcome to the new attendees. Just to let you know, we're recording, so if you don't want to be featured on the recording, just stay off mute and have your camera turned off, and we're happy to interact with you through the chat. We're just about to get started into talking about our topic tonight, being a peer worker in the lived experience space. So I might just start with a general question for you, Lindy. What exactly is a peer worker?
I think it's, let me preface by saying that I'm a little bit uneasy in being the total and only expert in this room, this Zoom room, especially in the company of John Eddy. So I just wish to acknowledge that and really hope that the discussion that we can have is not just a question that's going to be directed purely to me, but also is a question that we can all sort of discuss together and talk about. So I'm not the holder of all knowledge and I don't know everything. So I like to preface that as well, but I can only talk about what my perspectives of what a peer worker is. And I think if you were to ask what is a peer worker, which you just did, Hayley, I would say that a peer worker or a peer support person, someone who supports peers, a peer care companion, you can call them any name you like, are really people who have made a decision that they would like to support someone who is perhaps going through a particular emotional crisis or a time where they need support from someone perhaps who has had a similar experience or who has been through similar experiences in the past. So peer support really is not just confined to mental health or peer support within suicide prevention or postvention, bereavement, for example. But if we look around in our community or the communities that we live in, there are various ways that people can support one another by acting in a peer role. It has just become over time, I think, very formalized. And for example, in mental health, we have a, certificate in peer work mental health. We have other courses that people can do, through wherever, through Be Roses or, lifespan, whatever it is, in order to be able to fundamentally gain the skills in order to be able to support someone who is going through a tough time.
Yeah, and I want to get to training and stuff a bit later in the conversation, but just what you were talking about, support for somebody who's going through something similar. What makes it different from kind of like a counselor or a psychologist or somebody who talks to somebody who's in a situation that needs to be discussed?
I suppose what I would say is that it involves having what's called a peer approach. And a peer approach is very different to a more formal approach, which some people might say is a clinical approach. So a peer approach is about really being someone who is drawing ideally on their lived experience to be able to sit and support someone with an understanding and knowing of what that person may have been going or may be going through based on their own experience. So there is not a need or there is not a perception that a peer worker would go in there with the attitude to fix somebody. They are going in on an equal level as someone who can walk alongside that person with an understanding of what they may be going through. So the purpose of what they're doing is to listen, is to deeply connect, or hopefully, because it won't happen if there is no connection. Sometimes that's called engagement, but I like to call it connection. So there is that need to connect, that need to listen, that need to be able to walk alongside or sit alongside someone in their distress.
Yeah, okay. And how does that kind of approach reduce emotional distress or help to kind of soften the impact of what someone might be going through?
I think the way that it works is that the ideal is that the person who you are supporting has the opportunity to express or not express, but to have someone who understands and who is beside them. So, for example, someone who may be in emotional distress, there is that ability to be able to empathize with the person, show compassion, respect, and to maybe for that person for the first time to really listen and try and understand what it is exactly that they're going through. And one of the big barriers is often that people don't feel that they've been heard, or that they can't express themselves, or they can't talk about what it is that they're going through, or they find it difficult, or they don't even know how to express it. But to know that there is someone who is there, who is interested and who cares enough to want to know and support this person at that time.
Yeah, and that's really important. Like if I reflect back on my own lived experience when I've been in places where I've needed support and I've reached out to somebody who is going through something similar or has been through something similar, just not having to explain what that felt like, or like really, they just kind of knew without me having to put it to words what I was feeling. And it came with absolutely no judgment because that person had also been in that situation.
Mm.
Yeah, really powerful stuff.
And I think the other important thing, Hayley, just taking up on that is I think for it to work too, there needs to be that ability to, you know, have an open mind, to be able to listen without making assumptions about the person or what they've been through or how bad it is or it isn't that bad, or make no judgment, but just to be able to appreciate that what this, and to validate what the person is going through is real for them.
Mm.
And we're not there to minimalize it. We're not there to heighten it. We're not there to do anything other than to acknowledge that, you know, what is happening for you, what's going on. I'm here to listen. I may have some idea what you're going through because I too have a lived experience of suicide.
Yeah. And you've touched on a few of the sort of soft skills that are needed, the compassionate approach, the non judgment, all of those things. And you also spoke earlier about professional qualifications like certificate for in peer work. What are the sort of skills and experience that you need to be a peer worker?
If we, you know, I mean, we can move the qualifications to one side because there are roles for people to work in this space with appropriate training and appropriate guidance and appropriate procedures and measures in place that may not necessarily require certain qualifications. And I suppose that's something that draws on a person's lived experience as being the experience which indicates the beginning of the measure of their skill. It's vital to have that lived experience, in my opinion. So, and it's interesting that you mentioned that, Hayley, because often there has been situations in the past where peer workers have been discouraged from talking about their lived experience, that you just ignore that. You're there to peer work. That's okay to do that. Hopefully that's changing, and that being able to acknowledge the lived experience that the peer worker has and to be able to share that appropriately if required is something that can really help to support someone. But the qualities and that is needed or required by a peer worker, I think, no matter what level of training or background or prior knowledge, theoretical, academic, or whatever, put it to one side, there needs to be levels of or qualities or skills or strengths, we call them, that are vital to the role. And they can't really be quantified by ticking off, pieces of paper, I don't believe, or by qualifications. you can have the most qualified person in the world, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they have a compassionate heart, or that they're empathetic, or that they have the ability to truly listen, or that they have the self-insight to know when to be quiet and when to encourage someone to open up, whether they have the level of or the quality of being curious about what someone is going through, to want to know more, tell me more about what's going on for you, to have to not have the need to be the boss, to not have the need to be right, to not have the need to take absolute control and tell a person how that this is how you can be fixed and I know the way for you. So those sort of qualities, those strengths, I call them, are vital in this role, because you're dealing with people's lives. You have the opportunity to make a tremendous difference in someone's life, and you have what I say or call the opportunity and the absolute privilege to be to have the door open into someone else's life at that very distressing period of time, no matter what the experience of suicide might be.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing from you is that it's not so much about being taught something, but about having a level of maturity within yourself to put your own wants and needs aside to just be present in the moment with that person who might need your support.
Hmm. And I mean, we can do that very well as human beings, can't we? Like, we either can do that or we can choose not to. And you don't need specific qualifications to be a kind and compassionate human being.
So, how do you, probably a bit of a cheeky question, how do you get over the need to take away somebody's pain or solve their problems? Because I think that's also something that a lot of people struggle with, to not fix somebody. So how do you do that when you're in a moment with somebody and you can see a way forward for them, and you want to just say, "Hey, do this X, Y, Z." How do you personally put that aside and just be present?
I'm not saying that it's easy, and I have struggles with it, because it's like you've got I've got that. If you just did this, this might help, you know.
Yeah.
But it's a matter of, I think, being curious and being willing to put your own ego to one side. I don't know people's answers. I know my answers. I know what works for me, but I don't know what is necessarily going to work for someone else. But I'm there to listen. I'm there to be curious. I'm there to ask if it's appropriate, what they can share, and what they think some solutions might be, or some choices that they can make that may help them to create the life that they want to live.
Yeah. It's hard to overcome that, but then when you think about it from the other side of the coin, nobody wants to be told what to do either. Um, Earlier, Lindy, you spoke about sharing your story and how some workplaces don't like or discourage you from sharing your own lived experience when doing peer work. How much do you share, and what does that kind of feel like at the end?
I suppose I can give you a little example. Part of my lived experience is I lost my brother to suicide. I've got a number of experiences or things that I could talk about, but if I just take that had a profound impact on me at that time. So much so that my whole life turned around upside down in 12 months. In talking about my lived experience of suicide, losing my brother to suicide, I'm not going to be sharing what he did, how he did it, why he did it, his story. I'll be talking and sharing, if it's appropriate at that time, if I'm invited to, if I think it's relevant, about my experience as a result of being someone who is bereaved by suicide, the impact on me. So for me, my lived experience resulted in me changing my, leaving my marriage, my work, my everything went topsy-turvy. I totally changed a lot of the way I thought, what I did, trying to question what was going on. So there was a lot of trauma, there was a lot of upset, there was a lot of grief, there was a lot of sorrow, there was a lot of soul searching, there was a whole range of things. That was my experience. So I can have some empathy and understanding for someone who perhaps may be bereaved about what it is that they may be feeling. That's how I can create a connection. I understand how it feels to lose someone who I love dearly to suicide, completely out of left field, with no matter, even if I had an inkling that he might have been thinking about it or had mentioned to me before that he thought he might do it, I still never believed that he would. So the shock of that, I can understand. That's my experience, though, with being bereaved. Someone else's experience of bereavement may be very different because their reactions to what happened may be very different. For someone else, it may be that whilst they're bereaved, it could also mean that they are actually quite relieved that the concern and the worry and the stress and the trauma it's done. If they have been someone who has been caring for someone for a very long time, who has been struggling with suicide. So everyone's story is different, but the pain and the emotion and the loss, if we're talking about bereavement, whilst it's different, we all feel. We're human beings, not human doers or thinkers, or we feel. So that's the part of the lived experience that we try and connect in. I understand. I can understand how you might be feeling, but I don't presume that I know everything about your experience either. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and when you do share those things, what you've just shared with us, and what you share when you're doing your peer work, what's the reaction from the person that you're doing work with? Like, is it welcomed or uncomfortable? What's it like?
The reactions can be different for different people, but I would never presume to share my lived experience unless I really believed that it may be something that may help this person, and it would be minimal in what I shared. It might be the fact for some people that I too have a lived experience. I lost my brother as well. That might be it. I would not necessarily go into any more than that. And sometimes that is enough for that person to go, oh, she knows what it's like.
Yeah, it's amazing what happens when you do acknowledge your lived experience to somebody else who has a similar experience, and they immediately connect with you and say, "Hey, you're somebody that's just like me, and you get it. I can talk to you."
Yeah.
So, I don't know if you've had an experience where you've kind of shared too much, and you feel uncomfortable about what's kind of gone down. How do you kind of manage that?
I think over time I've become more and more very discriminating about how much I do share and what I don't share, even though I would say I did not ever I never started out sharing heaps of my lived experience. The only time I've ever really considered, oh, wow, have I said too much, was when I was the lived experience person who gave and shared my lived experience to a group of clinicians, doctors, council, shire council people, in the context of the beginning of a project that was going on where I lived in order to try and really bring suicide services together. And they asked me to go and speak about my lived experience. And in doing that, I was very purposeful in what I said and how I said it, because I didn't want to talk about my lived experience without having an impact on the people that was receiving it. So it was very purposeful about what I said. And what I wanted to do by doing that was really to touch their hearts, to say, people never know when, no family is immune to suicide. Just the next time you may be treating someone who comes through your door, please be aware that there is someone who loves them. There is a family, there are people around. So I was talking from that bereaved perspective, and some of the things that I had learned since that I didn't know before about how much a lived experience can impact. That was probably the time that I really questioned, was I a bit too much? Because people did become a little bit emotional. I know that I touched people's hearts, and it wasn't in a way that was in any intent to hurt anyone or, traumatize anyone. I didn't go into details about method or anything like that. It was just about how I had felt, and with a genuine wish and desire that I could touch them to realize that the people that walk through their doors, whether it be ED at the hospital or whether it be through their doctor's surgery or whether it be, through the council coming in and to find housing or whatever, that just remember that people who do attempt to take their own life or who have taken their own life have a family who have loved them and that they have been in pain.
Yeah.
Please don't disregard that. So I questioned that only because I obviously could see that there were some people who became emotional, but there were many, and to be fair, those people thanked me very much for how open and honest I'd been about the impact of losing my brother had been. And I also made a point to thank them all too, that thank you for everything that you do in supporting people. This is not about lived experience versus clinical approach, or a peer approach versus a clinical approach. We have to work together.
Yeah, and that's a really good point to be made, is that peer work sits alongside often clinical services, and we don't want to promote one over the other. I think they kind of work hand in hand in giving somebody the support that they need when they need it.
Absolutely.
So, getting down to more of the detail, what are some of the roles that peer workers can have? We spoke about, talking to people one-on-one when they're in a state of distress. Like, where does that happen, or are there different ways that peer work happens? In your experience, what are the kind of roles in this
look,
space?
I don't presume to know all of the different roles, and I'd invite John or anyone else who may have contributions here to make. Please jump in. Let's do this together. There are so many ways that people can become involved if they want to, and not everyone does. But the people that I know that do get involved in doing peer work or peer support work is because they've had an experience and they want to make a difference in someone else's life, or they don't want someone to go through what they've gone through, or they don't, they want to prevent just one more death, or, there's probably, that they're the most common. I want to make a difference. I don't want anyone to go through what I've gone through. So that's often the motivation for a lot of people. Where do they go with that? I think the avenues that are opening for people with lived experience of suicide in particular is increasing. The doors are opening. I know that, for instance, in New South Wales, with the Towards Zero Suicide initiatives, there is a strong recognition of the value of the voice of lived experience and ensuring that that voice is heard. It's challenging to see that in action and to ensure that that's being supported. I know that in Victoria it's the same. So there's various initiatives that are going on within communities, and I'm sure John can speak to that, to this, that, you know, there's support work, you know, that people can do through, you know, maybe engaging in Lifeline. There's support work within individual communities, in community safe spaces. There's all of these things. It's an area which is really increasing, and it's a matter of connecting in, and it might be a matter of connecting in with an organisation like Roses in the Ocean, that is an advocate, and an organisation that advocates the voice of lived experience, and using that as the value of it can never be underestimated. I don't know, John, if you've got some other things you can add.
Absolutely. I'll just use a couple of examples that I actually do myself. And one is I volunteer on the Roses in the Ocean warm phone line. And both these roles that I do, I took on before I started working with Roses full time. The other one is I'm a part-time peer support worker for Standby. And some of the most amazing moments I've had really is talking to other bereaved parents, and friends of mine question how I could possibly do that, being a bereaved parent myself. But the relief I see in another father's eyes when he can tell me that he's suicidal because he's lost his son recently and feels he's going out of his mind it's very powerful medicine for me as well. I mean, I feel almost selfish in some ways to do it because it helps me survive what I'm surviving. I absolutely love doing it, and in fact, to the point when Bronnie offered me the job, I said, as long as I don't get taken off the warm phone line. I think it's an incredible service. So I describe it as who better to be a fireman and running to save people, you know, out of fires than the fireman himself. You know, we've gone through it. Yeah.
So, John, what is the warm phone line for people who don't know what it is?
It's not a crisis line, so it's a callback service. So, for example, if you wanted to talk to someone about your lived experience of suicide, it can be any sort of lived experience. It doesn't have to be bereavement. You know, it could be you've survived an attempt or whatever you've gone through. You'll ring up leave a message. We'll call you back within 48 hours and peer match. So someone with a similar lived experience will call you back, and we'd simply just have a chat to you. How those phone calls go, sometimes it varies greatly. I've had some really good ones, and I've had one call where the woman was literally going to attempt suicide when I rang her, you know, and it's very confronting, but you know, it was an incredible experience to be there for that woman at that time. So yeah, it's an amazing service, I think.
And I want to jump back to you on that topic, John, later, about how you keep yourself well when it's so confronting like that. But just a bit more around the types of roles. I know you've recently been instrumental in the opening up of a safe space in your area. So can you maybe talk about what a safe space is and what peer workers, what role they play in a safe space?
Yeah, next Thursday, we actually open it. So it's been a dream, and a lot of work I've gone into it over a couple of years, really, even before Roses offered us the pilot site to set up this the Bustleton Community Safe Space. So it's essentially a safe space where people can go if they're feeling suicidal or in emotional distress. So it's run by volunteers. We're not chasing money from the government or anything, so we're largely self-funded. I'm putting my safe space hat on here and take my Roses hat off. So, and literally, I just got I've used my lived experience story and brought a heap of people together on the committee, and we've just worked together and got it off the ground. We've got a space that's been donated for 3 years. We just signed a lease, rent-free. We put it, with the help of Roses, put out expressions of interest to the public through social media and local papers and whatnot, and just got people to volunteer with the lived experience of suicide. And you know, obviously, we check them out closely to make sure they're okay to sit in the role as a peer worker, and train them up with Roses. Lindy's done a few of my volunteers today, I believe. With peer care companion and assist training, just minimal training, you know, just to offer these people essentially an ear You know, what do they need? They'll come in and see us, and we'll wait for them to tell us what they need more than anything. Some people want to hear your lived experience story. Some people want to sit there and just have a cup of tea and maybe a cry. You know, that's, again, like with the co-design process of doing it, you know, you tell us what you want, and we'll try and help you, and as best we can, we'll link you up with what services are available in our community. So that's a very important part of it, is mapping what's available. And, you know, someone, for example, may come in and say, oh, I'm feeling suicidal, I've lost my house, I've got financial trouble. So, oh, well, let's talk to someone who's good with finances and see if we can help you out of this. But let them lead the conversation.
Yeah, so the safe, thanks, John. The safe spaces and also the warm line, they're two really good examples of non-clinical support pathways that people with lived experience can get involved. But peer workers are also often embedded within the health system, and that's a whole other environment, because you're working as a person with lived experience alongside people that might not get it. And I've heard lots of stories about tensions with clinicians and you know, the struggle it takes to get recognition as a peer worker in those environments. And Lindy, you spoke a little bit about presenting to a group of people who come from a place where they might not understand as much as someone who has lived experience. Does anyone have any examples or tips or anything to kind of navigate that clinical space as a peer worker, and what the unique challenges are in that environment? It sounds like the... Oh,
My name's Lisa. Hi. I don't know if
hi,
you can
Lisa.
see me. Sorry. I'm sitting in my car and I joined a little bit late. I'm sorry.
That's
But
okay.
I was so keen to join. So I'm very new to the peer work space. I've got a lived experience of suicidality, and I'm working for Wellways at the moment on a 12-month contract for Ministry of Health. So it's all around employment of suicide prevention peer workers in the New South Wales health system, so the public system in New South Wales, which is the safe havens and the suicide prevention outreach teams. So that's for anybody who wants to become a suicide prevention peer worker. The New South Wales Health advertises those positions on the health website. And usually the requirement would be to have a lived experience yourself of most local health districts will include people who've got a lived experience of suicidality, or if they've got a loved one who has suicided. Some only employ people who have a personal lived experience of suicidality, but the job description will tell you, the job advert will tell you, and usually they'll say that they want people who are willing to obtain the Cert 4 in peer work certificate, and then the local health district will pay for it.
Right, so the health system approach is a little bit more rigid and structured and professionalized, I suppose, than some of these non-clinical spaces then.
No, they're well, it's only been happening for 2 years. And so the reason I've been employed and my team is to we're connecting with all of the local health districts around New South Wales and all of the peer workers who are working in them, to find the suicide prevention peer workers, to find out what's working and what's not working in the Towards Zero Suicide initiatives. So it's all pretty new. Sorry, what was your question? Oh, yes, but so there's safe havens. The safe haven is a non-clinical model. Quite a few of the safe havens have staffed with peer workers only, and the guest coming to the centre doesn't have to give their name. They don't have to identify themselves in any way. They can just attend for free and receive support from peer workers. And if the situation escalates beyond the capacity of the peer workers, then they would call a clinician. But the clinicians are often not on site. So in some safe havens, the clinicians are on site, but not in all of them. And then there's the suicide prevention outreach teams. That's a pairing of one clinician with one peer worker, and they get incoming calls and they go out to visit the person who's called, who's having suicidal thoughts.
Okay,
Yeah.
interesting. Thank you so much for
Yeah.
sharing, Lisa.
That's okay. It's very experimental,
Yeah,
and lots of different opinions around it. And there's not a lot of, there's guidelines, but there's not regulations around how the hospitals are running their safe havens and suicide prevention outreach teams. So we're looking at, do we need to have more regulations for more uniformity for people who want to get into this field of work?
right. Okay.
Mm.
Yeah, I know the New South Wales peer work guidelines, and they're very comprehensive, and can be useful if you're thinking about starting out in this space. Um, I want to move the conversation now to what you raised earlier, John, around when someone expresses that they're suicidal, or they're making a suicide attempt. As a peer worker, how do you manage a situation like that? Lisa, you spoke about escalating to clinicians, but if that kind of pathway is not available, Lindy, I wonder if you've had any experience in this, and how you kind of keep yourself well in such an emotionally charged situation.
Was the question for me or for John?
Yeah, for you, Lindy. Do you have any experiences in this?
So could you just repeat that? I'm sort of gone a bit blank. Yeah. I was actually thinking about something completely different. I was thinking about, it's probably really just before we do that, Hayley.
Yeah, sure.
I was thinking about how important it is to perhaps to define a lived experience of suicide, because that's something that can be sometimes lost, or there are different definitions. So, for example, at Rose's, the definition of a person with a lived experience of suicide is someone who's bereaved, someone who has made an attempt on their own life, someone who suffers from suicidal thoughts or ideation, and someone who cares for, and we're talking about close family or friends, who cares for someone who perhaps is going through suicidal distress. So it's important because some people don't appreciate that a lived experience covers all of those areas, and some would even suggest that it should be expanded, but that's another topic, to include another group or other groups. But it's important to understand that, as far as just in what Lisa was saying, that sometimes it's having a lived experience is not just about whether or not you have made an attempt on your own life, where in some areas that is what is the definition, or maybe a carer included. If you were to talk to standby, for instance, they would say, hang on a minute, you've forgotten a big group here, and that's the bereaved. That's our purpose. So there are some fundamental, and like anything to do with suicide, it is a very complex issue with a lot of complexities and a lot of layers, even down to the definition of what lived experience is. So, yeah, I just wanted to make that point, because sometimes that's not clear. And, I've had discussions even quite recently with people who have been coming in to do workshops and that, and going, no, a lived experience is just someone who has made an attempt on their own life, because that's what they've done. No, well, actually, that's a broader definition than that, because there are so many people who are impacted by suicide in many different ways.
Yeah.
So that was a question to answer the question, I think, about self-care, if you're in that situation where someone, I think, if someone is often if someone says, yeah, I'm seriously thinking about taking my own life, I don't want to live, I want to die, there is a fundamental automatic sort of reaction that is common if you're not if you don't talk to people in this area, is that common response to quick get the ambulance or quick call emergency services. This person wants to take their own life. We've got to do something immediately and we've got to do it. That's very different to perhaps finding someone or coming across someone who is in the act of taking their own life, who is in the process of doing it. There's many degrees of separation. And sometimes I think that's a really important thing to consider. And the response to that is what is really important. Obviously, if someone is in the act of taking their own life, or it is an immediate threat that they're going to take their own life, they have the means, they have the intent, they have everything available at their resources. The risk is really high and the warning signs have all been there, blah, blah, blah. Then obviously there is a need at that point. If there is no one else around to support or no family that can support them or that nothing that can be, yes, definitely we call emergency services straight away to get assistance for this person. That is unquestionable. What I'm sort of trying to say is that sometimes just because someone expresses that they want to take their own life, it needs to be heard and listened to and responded to in the context of what they're saying. Yes, I've thought about taking my own life. Yes, I'm thinking about taking my own life. There's a lot of questions around that. What is the level of concern? And this is not about taking a risk assessment. This is about being curious to find out about, is the person talking about now, next week, last year, 3 years ago? What's going on at the moment for this person? It's opening up the door of communication and curiosity and asking about it rather than automatically pressing the panic button or saying, this is what you need to do right now. And I hope I'm not speaking out of turn. I don't know, John, whether you can relate to what I'm saying, but
Absolutely. Yeah.
I see that a lot in organisations that come for advice from a lived experience lens. What do we do if someone says that they are thinking about suicide? And often what they have in their protocols is called 000. And that could be that's the last thing you do. Do you know what I mean? What about calling family? What about calling a friend? What about calling someone? What about being with them? What about continuing the conversation? What about being curious and finding out more? And I can understand why that is the response, because it's a very scary thing to hear.
Yeah.
It's not easy to hear because no one wants to see someone be in that much pain that they're even thinking about that.
Yeah. No, you're definitely spot on, Lindy. When I think back to times when I've been suicidal, that panic button is not what I need, but that listening and asking questions and getting to know why I'm feeling like this is my only option, that makes a whole world of difference. And the hitting the panic button is often what stops people from disclosing their thoughts of suicide.
Absolutely.
John, in your example of where you had somebody disclose their suicidality, not thinking about the response that you had, but after the fact, how did you feel emotionally and how did you take care of yourself given your lived experience? Like what sort of self-care strategies did you kind of enact to help cope with that personally?
Yeah, look, that one example I gave you lasted just over 2 hours, so it's pretty intense. The one thing that really helps me is just honestly talking to someone that gets it. Someone on that same peer work, isn't it? Really, at the same level, again at our level, I guess. Just someone who I don't want to talk to a counsellor or a professional or anything. I just wanted to talk to someone who understood what it was like to have that confronting phone call and talk it out. And then until I sort of really have that conversation, I feel like a wound up spring, to be honest. You know, you get told method and all the other stuff that's really confronting to us, especially with lived experience. It's always going to be confronting and hard to hear, but that's what they need to talk about, and that's why we've got to listen to it and then find that way of decompressing afterwards. And I think everyone here agrees it's going to be different for everyone. And likewise, when you're sitting with someone in that space, no one can tell us how we're going to look after ourselves afterwards. But that conversation with someone who just gets it, it's vital for me. I've had a couple of really tough calls, and I'm sort of learning what does work for me in that. And I find just that I've straight after the call, talking to someone about it and pulling the call apart and what it was that upset me is, and then I'm fine after that, ready to go again. And a good walk in the forest away from phones.
Yeah, so we're kind of creating a circle for ourselves, aren't we? We're peer workers, and then we speak to peer workers who need peer workers. It's yeah, a nice little community of people that kind of get it.
Hayley, I haven't said too much today,
Yeah,
but I'd just like to make some general comments as I could about peer working, and that's to understand the difference between trainers, peer workers, and people who are giving a talk on their lived experience. And sometimes the three of them get mingled up together. And there's a real risk sometimes with trainers that they're giving people hints on how to do something. So it can end up being sort of an amateurish approach at psychiatry or psychology in some respects. So there's an important part with trainers that they are trained to be trainers, or else it can be very harmful. With peer workers, I'm not of the view that, with a bit like Lindy said, that the real level of training is important. The important things that came out of that was compassion and understanding and empathy, being willing to listen, being non-judgmental. You don't have to train. The thing that saved my life, I should admit, I'm a suicide attempt survivor. So I sit in a different group that really isn't well represented in peer work. And the thing that saved my life was a peer group, a facilitated one. We were all attempt survivors, and we all worked with each other to sort out talk about our own way of doing it, and we were guided through that process. That was part of the acceptance and commitment therapy that I used to do it. And out of that, it was very clear you didn't have to train us. We all knew when to talk. We all knew when to hug. We all knew when to stand back. We all knew when to let people be angry if they wanted to be angry. All of those things are natural within it. Now, out of that, I've done, because I've been at this game for far too long, so like 12 years, I've been an amateur, if you want to call them amateur, peer support for lots of people, friends who've got a son who's in a mental institution, and he doesn't want to be there because he probably shouldn't be there anyway, but he's suicidal. And I just go and sit and talk to him. But we've got to be careful about, and I think John got it first, they've got to be peer matched. There's nothing worse than someone saying, I know how you feel, when they're talking to a bereaved person and they're a suicide attempt survivor, because you don't, or the other way around. The other way around is really critical. Or to say things like, why didn't you think about, well, people really love you, Linda, that was one that you said, that can be problematic. Because when you're absolutely suicidal, you don't believe that they do, I'll take that back. You believe they do, but they're better off without you. So reminding them that there's people out there who loves you makes it even worse, because you're in this space that you're saying, I believe that I'm no good, I'm useless, I'm a waste of the world. Everyone out there's trying hard, they all love me, but they'd all be better off without me. So we've got to make sure that the right people talk to the right people. I think that's critical. So the peer matching that John talked about is essential, or else we can get ourselves in all three areas. Telling your story the wrong way to people who are susceptible and without any guidance of it can be very dangerous. Trainers who aren't properly trained, but cross peer workers who think they're doing the right thing but are in fact giving exactly the wrong message. But the key to it, peer work, isn't to train them up, it's to teach them to listen, to not tell them, do what I did, here's my story, it worked for me, it'll work for you. I often tell the people that I work with that we're all taking a totally different route. My route's got nothing to do with your route, but we're going on the same journey. So rather than saying, I know how you feel, I say, I know the feeling, because I don't know how they feel. And that's the way to get them to open up and talk. And they're just happy to, once they know that you're one of them, because a lot of them believe the difference between feeling lonely and being alone is when you're suicidal and right at the end, you're not lonely, you're alone. You feel like you're the only person in the world that thinks like that. And if you can find your tribe, find someone else who has thought like that and understands what it's like to think like that, that's a godsend.
Yeah, I just want to pull out two really great points that you made, Graham.
I didn't make a great point. Don't be kind to me, Hayley.
Oh, you always make fantastic points. And that is that skill, it's experience matching. You know, we're talking about peers here, people who have similar experiences. And that is a key to peer work, that you're matched with somebody who has a similar experience so that you can use that relationship to kind of be with that person, not assist them, not help them, but be with that person when they're going through something that you understand. And the other point you made around the so many different places where peer work can happen. It's not necessarily a formal environment like in a hospital or a safe space or on a warm line, but it's in the community with people that you interact with on a social basis. You know, peer work doesn't have to be formalized, as Lindy said right at the start. It can be so valuable just in that informal way.
It is. How in my trip, I've probably given 200 talks, and that's why I made the difference between talking, peer work, and trainers. And I tend not to talk about events, but how I felt. Events are an important part of your story, but I was feeling like this when this happened, and I felt like that when that happened. When I got there, this is the way I felt. And nearly always at the end of my talk, there'll be 5 or 6 people come up. I usually talk to vulnerable men of my vintage, and they always start with the same thing. I've never told anyone this before, and the thing that's allowed them to open up to speak wasn't my story, but they related to the feelings of the process. So that's just a little hint that I throw out there for what it's worth.
Thanks, Graham. And we are running out of time. But before we get to 8 o'clock, I just want to remind everyone to take care of yourselves tonight. We are getting into the quite later hours of the day, and we've talked about some pretty heavy things about people being suicidal and needing immediate support. So I just want to remind everyone to enact whatever self-care strategies that you have. Go and talk to a peer worker, contact the Roses in the Ocean warm line, whatever it is that you need to do to feel in a good place to get a good night's rest tonight. With 1 minute to spare, is any last pearls of wisdom that anybody wants to chuck in? If you've got it, put it in the chat, or now's the time.
It's 5 o'clock here.
Sorry, I am very East Coast centric in my approach, aren't I?
And John, what a beautiful place you're at. I once swam a third of the way around the pier. It was a one of those triathlons or swim, but no, it was a team event. So I got about a third of the way around, but it's a great spot.
I walk it often. I haven't swum it because I sink when I fall in the water. So unless I've got a wetsuit on, but yeah, it is a beautiful place.
Well, thank you very much, Lindy, for joining us as the guest tonight, and also John, Graham and Lisa for your contributions to the discussion. It's been very valuable. I'll be sending around an evaluation link after this, and I'll pop my email address in the chat now so you can grab it if you want before we close the meeting. But yeah, thank you all so much, and I'll let you know when the recording's published, and it's been really nice to spend time with you this evening.
Thank you very much, Lindy. You were terrific.
Very much. Yeah.
Well done. Well done.
Thank you. Thanks,
Yeah,
Hayley. See you
appreciate it.
guys.
Bye.
Okay, bye.